Hey, this is Mike for KickstartPoker.com, and in this video I will go over the most important hands of the $11 Sunday Mini Kickoff tournament that I played on PokerStars this weekend. I had a relatively deep run, lasted around 5 hours in the tournament, finishing 459th out of 8,800 players, cashing for 30 bucks. I rarely play MTTs actually, I'm more of a sit-and-go player, but I feel I played this tournament pretty well. I also made some mistakes here and there, which we'll also take a look at in this video. This tournament is a deep stack tournament. You start with 5,000 chips, so at the 10-20 level, that's 250 big blinds. It was also a non-turbo tournament, so the blind levels were, I think, 12 minutes. Could also be 10 minutes, but I think it was 12. So here's the first hand, a queen jack offsuit. Under the gun guy raises. We get one caller. And I think we can just call here. The guy raising under the gun is probably on a pretty tight open raising range. The other guy calling, we don't have a lot of information on him, only 7 hands. But we're deep stacked in this case. We have 5,000 chips. We're in position versus 2 other players. So I think a call is the best play here. Re-raising doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the under the gun raiser is probably on a pretty tight range. So we don't really want to bloat the pot here with queen jack, and we can just call in position and see if we can hit something. So we call and the blinds both fold, and we hit a jackpot flop with the nuts here. The pre-flop raiser checks and the other guy checks as well. I think we should just check behind here because we hit the board so hard that it is very unlikely for any of our opponents to hold some kind of hand here. There's only 1 queen left in the deck and 2 jacks. So mathematically speaking, the odds of someone holding a queen or a jack here are pretty small. There are some straight draw possibilities with open-enders and gut shots, but overall the chance that any of them has some kind of a hand are pretty small, and I think we should just check behind here and hopefully let them catch up a bit on the turn. The turn is a 7 of diamonds and puts a second diamond on board, and the initial raiser bets 100. He doesn't necessarily have to have some kind of a hand here. He just saw both of us check behind on the flop, so maybe he's just stabbing at the pot right now to try and take it down. He could also maybe have a draw of some sort, like a straight draw, or maybe he picked up a flush draw. The other guy calls, and at this point I think we should definitely raise here. The pot is now 410 chips. We want to build a little bit of a pot with such a strong hand, and now that the second diamond is on board, maybe someone has a flush draw. We can get value from straight draws as well. So you know, maybe somebody has a jack, maybe a queen. So we really want to get some value now from our monster hand. We shouldn't raise really large here because we don't want to chase off our opponents. And I raised to 320, which I think is a decent raise size. I think it's small enough that we can still get some action here, and it's not too big that we chase away our opponents. This guy just calls, and then this guy comes over the top to 920, which is an interesting raise. It could still be something like a flush draw or a straight draw, but it is also a possibility that he has trip queens or a pair of jacks, and maybe a very strong hand like a full house with a pair of 7s, although it's not very likely that he has that. But these are hands that are within his range. I think that we should just call here to keep the under the gun guy involved maybe. He just flat called my raise to 320. Maybe he has some kind of a draw that he's willing to still continue with. So I think calling is a little bit better than re-raising, even though the guy raising to 920 probably has some kind of a hand. So if we re-raise, we might just get it all in here. But I prefer calling here to hopefully keep the other guy, Benbo86, involved. So we call, and Benbo86 folds. The river is the deuce of clubs, and Villain bets out 1,300 chips. At this point, the pot is already 3,670, so we can just shove here and hopefully get a call. It seems that Villain does have some sort of a hand. This river bet seems like a value bet to me. So I think it's likely that he at least has 2 pair queens and jacks, maybe trip queens, maybe a full house, but overall we just have to shove here and hope that he calls. Which he does, and he actually has king queen. So he flopped a really big hand with trip queens and king kicker, and we managed to double up and win a really big pot. The second hand is pocket 3s. It gets folded around to us. You can limp here, you can fold, you can raise. I think all options are fine. I prefer raising most of the time over open limping, so that's what I do here, and I get one call from the button. The blinds fold, and we hit middle set, which is a good hand. And villain seems to be very loose passive. We only have 15 hands on him, so it's really a small sample, but we have to go with what we have here. He has a VPIP of 40%, and he has an aggression factor of 0.5, so he seems to be very loose passive. So I like to make a continuation bet of half the pot. I think with a strong hand like this, even though it's maybe not very likely that villain has some kind of a hand here on this type of board, I think we should just play it fast against a loose passive player like this and just bet out and make a continuation bet. And we in fact get raised, which probably indicates a pretty strong hand, and I think it's likely that he has at least a top pair of jacks, assuming that he is in fact a very passive player. So given that he has a pretty strong hand, I think we should definitely re-raise here and hopefully get some more chips in, which we do. We raise to 471. I'm not sure about this raise size actually. I think we should have gone a little bit more, because if this is in fact a very passive player and he's raising us in the flop, it's very likely he has a pair of jacks, but you know, there are a lot of turn cards that can kill the action. If another diamond hits on the turn, that will definitely slow him down. If a queen, king, or ace comes on a turn, he will probably slow down. So I think we should raise a little bit more to like 550, 600 to just get a little bit more chips in the pot when villain still has a strong hand, and to prevent any turn and river cards just slowing him down. He calls us, and the turn is the 4 of spades. It doesn't really change the board a whole lot. I don't think he was raising with hands like ace-5 or 5-6 or something and just made it straight, because a passive player is very unlikely to just raise us on the flop with something like a gut shot. So I don't think he has any of those hands. It is favorable that the card is lower than a jack, so if he has a pair of jacks, which I think is pretty likely, then in that case, this card shouldn't really worry him all that much. So we're just going to bet out again. I think somewhere in the region 800 to 1000 seems all right. And we bet 800. Again, I think we should maybe bet a little bit larger here, given his likely hand range. I think we're missing a little bit of value here by just betting 800. I think we could get more chips off him if we bet a little bit more. He in fact calls, and the river is the queen of clubs, which is not the greatest card, because if he has a pair of jacks, this card maybe slows him down a little bit, but I think we should make a decent value bet again of 1800 chips, which seems like a good bet if he does have a pair of jacks. And he does call, and he shows jack 9. So that kind of makes sense how the hand played out. I think we didn't play this hand optimally, in the sense that we should have probably raised a little bit more on the flop, and we should have bet a little bit more on the turn as well. And if we played it like that, we probably would have gotten his entire stack, or at least some more chips than we got at the moment. So this was a decently played hand, but I think we could have gotten a little bit more value by raising stronger on the flop and betting more on the turn. Then we pick up king 10 suited on the button, and it gets raised from middle position. I think we should just call here. The guy who open raises, we only have 30 hands on him, but he is really tight. He has a VPIP of only 13% and a pre-flop raise percentage of 10%. So when he raises from that position, he is on a pretty tight range. We have a really deep stack. We're in position with a decent hand like king 10 suited. So I think just calling makes the most sense here, which we do. And the blinds get out of the way. We get the perfect flop. We flop the nuts with the ace high straight, and villain checks to us. I think we should definitely just check behind here, because even though this guy is tight, he doesn't make a continuation bet on this dangerously looking flop. So because he's just checking to us, it seems that he's a little bit afraid of this flop. And if we bet, I think he's just going to fold most of the time. So we're going to have to check behind and hopefully let him catch up a little bit on the turn. The turn is a 6 of clubs, and he checks again. At this point, I prefer betting, because, there's a little point in waiting until the river to bet. If he has some kind of hand, he will probably pay us off on the turn. And with such a strong hand, we want to build a little bit of a pot. So I think betting is better here than just waiting until river, which we do. We bet 120, and he actually folds. So unfortunately, we couldn't get any value from our monster hand in this case, but that's fine, and we take down a small pot. Then with pocket tens and the under the gun guy raises to 120, we're in very early position here, under the gun +1 with pocket tens. You could re-raise here, but I think calling is also fine. The guy who raises under the gun should have a pretty tight range. And there's still a lot of players left to act behind us. So with pocket tens, I don't mind just calling here and see what develops. And it gets folded around. The small blind calls, big blind folds, and the flop comes down Jack 8-4. The pre-flop raiser checks to us. And this seems like a good spot to make a value bet here because there's only one overcard to our pair of tens, and we will have the best hand here a lot of the time. But it is also vulnerable to a lot of turn and river cards. We don't really want to see a queen, king, or ace, and there are also some straight draws possible on this flop. So we need to bet here for value as well as protection. I think 200 is fine. You could also bet a little bit more, but 200 is okay. The small blind calls and the under the gun pre-flop raiser folds. The turn is the 8 of clubs, which puts a possible flush draw on board, and villain checks to us. I think we should just check behind here. The pot is 800 chips now, and the board didn't really change much. So if we bet, he's likely going to call again. I'm not sure if there are many worse hands in his range that he's going to call us with here. We're just going to keep the pot under control and check behind and see what happens on the river. The river is another jack, double pairing the board, and villain bets out 440 chips. Looking at his bet size, this really looks like a value bet. He's betting a little bit over half the pot. If he was actually bluffing here, I think he would probably bet more, like 600, 800 or more. So it's definitely possible that we're beat here by a full house with Jack X or 8X. But on the other hand, we're getting a really good price. We're getting almost 3-1, so we only need to be correct around 25% of the time in order to make a call here. And also villain is playing pretty loose aggressive based on his HUD stats. So I think that we will have the best hand here more often than 25% probably. Although I'm still not thrilled about calling here just because his bet really seems like a value bet here. But given the price that we get, I think we just need to call here. Which we do, and he actually shows 6-7 of clubs. So he had a gut shot straight draw on the flop, and he turned a flush draw as well, and decided to bluff on the river when he missed. So even though he bet relatively small on the river, he was still bluffing, and we made a good call there with pocket tens. Insane Poker 3 raises here to 2.5 times the big blind for middle position. He's a pretty loose aggressive player, and with Jack 10 offsuit on the button, I think we should just call here. We're very deep stacked still, so we have the room to play. Jack 10 offsuit is a little bit too weak to 3-bet here, I think, so calling seems to be the best play. The blinds get out of the way, and the flop comes down 10-5 queen, giving us second pair. And villain bets out 122 chips. I think we should just call here. Our second pair may be the best hand at this point, but it is still a pretty marginal hand. There are a lot of turn and river cards that could devalue our hand. So, it's not really a super strong hand. And we're in position, so we can just call and see what happens on the turn. The turn is the 3 of clubs. Not a very scary card. And villain bets again 236. And I think we can just call again here, just because villain is pretty aggressive, so there's still a good chance that we have the best hand and we're getting a good price of a little over 3-1. But I actually decided to fold, which I don't think is the optimal play. I think given the price that we're getting, I think we should just call here. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments what you think about this hand, whether I should call here or just fold. I think calling is a little bit better maybe, but I'm not sure. It's a very close one. But we decided to fold, and let's move on to the next hand, which is a pair of 8s in the cutoff position. It gets folded around to us, and this is a nice hand to just open raise with. I go for 3 times the big blind. You can also go 2 or 2.5 times the big blind. That's all fine. We have a big stack here, so we should be raising pretty wide from late position. And then the small blind 3-bets us. We have 38 hands on him, and he is really tight. He has a VPIP of 13% and a pre-flop raise percentage of 8. So he probably has a pretty strong hand when he 3-bets us. The big blind folds, and we decide to call, which I think is fine. We only have to pay another 240 chips to call, getting a little better than 2-1 pot odds. If we flop a set, we can really win a big pot here, and we have position as well. But I think in general, if we miss the flop, we're often just going to have to give up because this guy is so tight, and when he 3-bets us from out of position, he probably has a pretty strong hand. So in most cases, we're just going to have to give up if we don't flop a set. The flop comes down 9 king deuce rainbow, and villain bets 342 chips, and we should just fold here. There's a little point in calling or trying to raise him off his hand. This flop hits his range a lot better than it does ours. And given his tight range, I think we should definitely just fold here and let him take the pot. Ace queen from under the gun. We decide to raise it up to 3 times the big blind. We get 2 callers and the flop comes down 9, 10, 9. The small blind checks to us. We make a continuation bet here of a little bit over half the pot, which I think is fine. The board is paired and relatively dry. There are some straight draw possibilities out there, of course, but we have the queen, so we're blocking some of those straight combinations. The only thing is that the guy in the cutoff position is very loose passive based on his HUD stats, so that diminishes our fold equity a little bit, but still I think this is a profitable spot to just make a continuation bet. And the passive guy indeed calls, the small blind folds, and the turn is a deuce of spades, which seems like a pretty harmless card, but still with ace high against a very passive opponent, I prefer just checking here, because a passive opponent is going to call with a lot of hands, and we don't really want to create a really big pot out of position against a very passive opponent that is likely to call us down a lot, also on the turn and river. Plus, if we check, he's often just going to check behind because he's so passive, so we don't really risk getting bluffed off our hand here. He does check behind, and the river is the ace, giving us a pair of aces. And at this point, we should definitely make a value bet, hopefully get a call by a pair of tens or a pair of deuces or maybe a small pocket pair or something. And we decide to bet 700 into 880, which I think is too much actually here, because even though this player is passive and he will call down with a lot of hands, I think if he actually has a hand like a pair of tens or deuces or a small pocket pair, he's not going to call 700 chips. But he would probably call something like 350, 400, 500, something like that. The only thing is if he actually called us on the flop with ace high, he just made a pair of aces. So in that case, he will probably call 700 chips here, but that's pretty much the only hand that he's probably willing to call this big bet with. So overall, given his entire range, I think it's better to bet like 350, 400 here to increase the chances of getting a call. So I think betting 700 is a little bit too much. And he actually does fold, so yeah, I think we should have bet a little bit less there to increase the chances of getting called. We get 6-7 of clubs, and under the gun limps in for 60 chips. I think we should just limp behind here with such a big stack that we have, and a good hand like 6-7 suited is a nice hand to play. It gets folded around, the big blind checks, and the flop comes down deuce 4-7 rainbow. Both opponents check to us, and I make a value bet of 110 chips. With top pair and a backdoor flush draw and straight draw, our hand is good enough to bet for value here. It's still pretty marginal, and there are a lot of turn and river cards that can devalue our hand, so betting here is the best play. And the loose passive guy calls, and the other guy folds. And we turn 2 pair, which is nice. We should have the best hand here a lot of the time. And we get checked to again. So I make another value bet of 250, a little more than half the pot, and our opponent check raises us to 960. We do have 2 pair, but I think this opponent, given how passive he seems to be when he raises here, I think he has a pretty strong hand. He could have a set, he could have top pair, he could have 2 pair, but overall I think he has a pretty strong hand when he just check raises us here. We have a strong hand ourselves with top 2 pairs, so I think the best play is to just call here. We're getting 2.3 to 1, so we're getting a good price. And even though villain is showing a lot of strength, we can still have the best hand here a decent percentage of the time, as he could have hands like ace-7, king-7, a worse 2 pair like deuce-4, deuce-6, deuce-7. So we're just going to call here. And the river comes to deuce of clubs, pairing the board, and villain bets out full pot, 2,350. And this is a really tricky one. I think we should just fold here because given how passive this player is, I think our 2 pair is almost never good. He could have a full house, he could have a straight, and to be honest, I don't see him do this with a hand that is worse than ours. For example, a hand like ace-7 or king-7, he probably wouldn't bet out so strongly here on this river. So I think we're beat most of the time, even though we get a decent price, 2 to 1 pot odds, so we only have to be correct 33% of the time. I think we should definitely fold. We very rarely have the best hand here. I think less than 33% definitely. But I actually decided to call here, which I think, looking back at it, is a mistake, given how passive villain is. And he does show a straight with 8-5. So looking back at it, I think we should definitely just fold the river because it's very unlikely that our two pair is good here. So this was an interesting hand, and I made a mistake on the river by just calling there against his passive opponent. We get ace king, we raise it up to 500, so 2.5 times the big blind, and we get called by the big blind. The flop comes down, deuce 8-7, and villain checks to us. He is very passive. Over 73 hands, he has a VPIP of 21% and a pre-flop raise of 8% and a post-flop aggression factor of 0.5, so he is pretty tight and passive. And on this flop, we just make a continuation bet of around half the pot, which I think is decent on a board like this. It's unlikely that villain has something. He's very passive, so we will probably call pre-flop with a pretty wide range. But on a flop of deuce 8-7, it's very unlikely that he has anything here. So we're just going to make a continuation bet, mostly for value, and given how passive he is, there's still a lot of worse hands in his range that he's just going to call us with. And he actually does check call the 600. The turn is the deuce of hearts, which doesn't change the board a whole lot. So I prefer just checking behind here, because if he just check called on the flop, he's probably going to call again when the board doesn't really change much. And also given his stack size, he has only 2,700 behind, and the pot is already 2,500 chips. So if I bet here, he might just be tempted to check raise all in as he feels getting committed. So checking behind definitely is the best play. And the river is the king of spades, and he checks again. And at this point, I definitely think we have the best hand here. So we're going to make a value bet of 1,200, which is around half the pot. I'm not sure if this bet size is actually optimal. It would probably be better to just bet a little bit less to get calls from a wider range of hands, you know, a pair of eights, a pair of sevens, maybe ace highs, maybe small pocket pairs. Given that he only has 2,700 behind, this is a pretty big bet for him. So I think we're better off making a bit of a smaller bet and hoping to get a call from a lot of the weaker hands in his range. And he actually does fold. So I think looking back at it, we should bet a little bit less than 1,200 here to maximize the chances of getting a call. The next hand is pocket aces. It gets folded around to us. We have around 25 big blinds, and we just raise it up to 2 times the big blind. And we get 3-bet by bossing 63. The other guys fold. This guy's playing very tight aggressive with a VPIP and pre-flop raise of 23-12 and an aggression factor of 3. And I decide to just flat call here, mainly for the reason that we're pretty short with only 25 big blinds, and that if we re-raise here, we're forcing our opponent to decide if he wants to play for the rest of our stack. And this guy is pretty aggressive, so I think he's 3-betting with a decently wide range most of the time. If this was a passive opponent, I would just probably 4-bet him, because in that case he would probably have a pretty strong hand. But in this case, against this very aggressive opponent, he can still have a pretty wide range, and I don't want him to fold a lot of his weaker hands, so I'm just going to slow play and call with my aces here. And we flop a top set of aces, and I'm just going to check to the pre-flop raiser here, hoping he makes a continuation bet, which he does. He bets around half the pot here, and I'm just going to check call. Check raising would be a mistake, I think, because it would make him fold all his weaker hands. And hopefully we can just get him to bluff one more time on a turn or river. So we're just going to check call. The turn is a deuce of spades, which puts 4 cards to a straight out there, but it's very unlikely that he has a 4 in his hand, because he probably wouldn't 3-bet pre-flop with a lot of his 4x combinations. So we're just going to check and hope that he bets again, which he doesn't. And the river is the 8 of diamonds. We only have 3,000 chips left, and the pot is already very big. So at this point, I'm just going to shove all in and hope that he calls. It's very unlikely that he calls, but when I check, I'm pretty sure he's going to check behind almost always. And we only have a half pot bet left in our stack. So we're hoping that he calls somehow with a pair here, although I think it's very unlikely. He will just probably fold here, which he does. But I think we just got maximum value from our pair of aces. We got 1 extra bet out of him on the flop. And when you're pretty shallow with just 25 big blinds, it can pay off a lot of the time to just slow play your hand and get a little bit of extra chips, especially when you're up against an aggressive opponent who has a pretty wide 3-betting range and who is likely to also continue playing aggressively post-flop. So we pick up a nice pot of 6,500 chips. The next hand is 10-3 offsuit on the button, and it gets folded around to us, and we decide to make a steal raise again. I included this hand to show that you can raise with very marginal hands in late position to steal the blinds. You know, the players in the blinds are tight. They are likely to give up a lot of their hands. So even though, of course, 10-3 offsuit is pretty much a garbage hand, you can still often pick up the blinds here. And when you have a stack of around 25 big blinds, you can still make a lot of these steal raises and pick up some pots here and there to accumulate some chips. And in this case, it fortunately works and both our opponents fold and we take down the pot. In this hand, the cutoff opens to 2 times the big blind, the small blind calls, and we're getting really good pot odds of almost 6-1. So I'm just going to call here as well with Jack 10 offsuit and see what develops. We hit top pair with the Jack kicker, which is a nice hand, and the small blind checks. I decided to check as well, but I think looking back at it, maybe betting here is better because we do have a pretty good hand with top pair, but there are a lot of turn and river cards that could devalue our hand. Any queen, king, or ace, or any diamond could potentially be bad for our hand, although a diamond would give us a flush draw, of course. But I think this is a good spot to actually make a donk bet here on the flop. The default play would be to just check here to the pre-flop raiser, but I think a donk bet is a reasonable option here with this hand. The pre-flop raiser doesn't make a continuation bet and also checks, and the turn comes to 5 of hearts, and this guy bets 1,839 chips. Fred013 is a very aggressive player, and I think he does this with a lot of hands that we beat. He may do this as a semi-bluff with a flush draw, or maybe a straight draw or something, or he could do this with a pair of sixes, a pair of fives or deuces. Maybe even ace high and king high. So overall, I think he's doing this with a lot of weak hands and bluffing hands. So I think we should definitely call here, which we do. And the pre-flop raiser folds. The river is the 3 of diamonds, putting 3 diamonds out there. And also a straight with all the 4x combinations, which I don't think he has a lot of. Considering that he just flatted in the small blind pre-flop. So maybe a hand like ace-4 or pocket fours could also be an option. And he makes a pretty big bet on the river here, which looks a bit like a bluff. It doesn't look like he wants us to call. It could still be a hand like a flush, that he was just semi-bluffing with a flush draw on the turn and now made his flush on the river. It could also be that he had a low pair that he's turning into a bluff. It could also be a hand like ace high or king high. Sometimes it could be a straight with a hand like ace-4 or pocket fours. But overall, given his bet size and given how aggressive he is, I think there's a lot of bluffs in his range, and I think it's going to be a profitable call with pot odds of 2.5-1. We need to be correct at least 29% of the time, and I think that's going to be the case here. So I decided to call, and he actually turns over pocket fours for a straight, which is kind of unfortunate. But on the other hand, the fact that he bet on a turn with pocket fours with just a gut shot and third pair, I think we made a pretty decent call here, simply because of the fact that he will be bluffing so often here. On the other hand, he did make a substantial bet on the river, so it's costing us quite a few chips to find out if he actually was bluffing or if we did have the best hand. So yeah, I'm not sure if this was the best play to just call here on the river. It was a pretty close one, but it was still a very expensive hand, which cost us around half our stack, so that was an unfortunate result. All right, let's move on to the next hand, which is 6-7 offsuit. It folds around to the small blind, and now the question is if we're going to limp, fold, or raise. We're pretty short stacked at the moment. Looking at the number of true big blinds that we have here, we should add 240, and that is 2/3 of the antes to the big blind here. So that's going to be 400 plus 240 is 640 as the true big blind. So that means we have a total of only 7.5 true big blinds here in this case. And I think with a connected hand like this, we can just shove here, even though villain in the big blind has a very big stack of 32,000 chips, which makes it a pretty close one because he has the option to call us pretty wide. On the other hand, he's not going to call us super wide here, I think. And 6-7 offsuit is very unlikely to be dominated in case we do get called by hands like ace-x or king-x or something. Our hand is often going to be live, and it is a connected hand as well. So overall, I think this is going to be a profitable shove, although it is a really close one given how deep stacked our opponent is. But we do make the shove, and we actually get called. Let's see what happens. We get called by ace-5 offsuit, but we're lucky enough to hit a pair of sevens on the flop. So yeah, I think this was a pretty close shove, and it can go either way. It's going to be profitable, I guess, but it's only going to be marginally profitable to shove there against this big stack, big blind. But it works out in this case, fortunately, and we managed to double up. The next hand is pocket nines. We see a raise and a call and another call. And I think this is a good spot to shove. There's already 4,500 chips in the pot, which is more than half our stack. We still have enough chips that we have a little bit of fold equity. We have a decent hand. The two guys who called the raise haven't shown any real strength, so they will often call there with relatively weak hands. So this seems like a good spot to make a squeeze play and shove all in here with pocket nines, which I do. And one guy calls, the other one's fold. And we win against ace-jack. We were just coin flipping, but I think with pocket nines, that was a very good spot to just shove all in. And we managed to pick up a big pot. Here we have pocket queens in the big blind, and we get a shove from middle position for around 10 big blinds. And the cutoff overshoves for 22 big blinds. The other guys fold. And this is an easy call. Sometimes you're up against kings or aces, but there's no way we're going to fold here for 14 big blinds that we have behind. And we were up against nines and sixes, and we pick up a huge pot, which is nice. King 7 offsuit in the big blind, and the small blind raises us to 2580. This guy's been very active so far. Post-flop he's pretty passive, but pre-flop he's raising a lot of hands, especially in late position with a steal percentage of 75%. So in this case, when we have a pretty big stack, I just 3-bet him here because he's steal raising so often from late position. And even if he calls, I can still play the hand in position. But with a big stack, we have the room here to make 3-bets with relatively marginal hands. And especially against a player who's very active and making a lot of raises from the small blind against us, we should be playing back at him. And this is a good spot to just 3-bet him here and try to take the pot down. And he does fold, and we pick up a nice pot. So it's important to be aggressive when you have a big stack, especially against players who are getting out of line a little bit and raising you a lot from the small blind versus your big blind. This is also good for future hands in the sense that you fight back a little bit and he sees that he can't run you over. So in the future, he probably won't raise as often from the small blind, so you're getting some extra value in future hands as well. Ace-king in the hijack, we're going to raise it up to 6,200. And we get a call from the big blind. The flop comes down king 3-4 rainbow. It's a pretty dry flop, and villain checks to us. We make a continuation bet of 6,000 chips. It's a pretty small continuation bet, but I think that's the good size because in this dry flop, there's very little that our opponent can have. So we want to keep him in with his weak hands and make a relatively small bet. He does have a pretty big stack, so he can afford to make some loose calls here. And he raises us to 15,600. And on this particular flop, which is so dry and we have top pair, top kicker, I think there's a reasonable chance that he's doing that as a total bluff. He is pretty aggressive, and if he thinks that we don't have much of a hand, this seems like a good spot to just check raise bluff. So I think we just need to call here and keep all his bluffing hands in. If we re-raise here, we'll only get action from his stronger hands, and for example, if he has a hand like king queen, king 10, king jack, we're often going to get his chips by the river anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But by calling, we keep all his bluffing hands in and hopefully get some extra value on the turn and river if he decides to bluff again. So I think calling is the best play. The turn is the 4 of clubs and he bets 23,500. So at this point, he either has a bluff or he has a pretty strong hand. But given that we only have 35,000 behind, we should just shove all in here and hope that we get called by a worse hand. So we're going to shove. He actually does call and turns over king 10. I'm happy with the way I played this hand by just calling his check raise on the flop. And he had a pair of kings, so it was going to go all in by the river anyway. But by just calling his check raise on the flop, I kept the bluffing hands in his range in to also get some extra value from his bluffing hands. We get pocket jacks in the cutoff, and there's a raise from middle position to 12,000 chips, so 3 times the big blind. Villain has a big stack and is also playing loose aggressively, and at this point there's already 21,600 chips in the pot, and I have 95,000 left. So I think the best player is to just shove. We have around 23 big blinds left, and there's already around 25% of our stack in the middle right here. So shove is the standard player, I think, and let's see what happens. The other guys fold. We get called, and we lose to ace-queen. So this was the last hand of the tournament, and we were in a coin flip situation. Unfortunately, we couldn't win this one, but I think shoving here was pretty standard here with pocket jacks. Alright, that was it for this video. I hope you liked it. This was the $11 Sunday Mini Kickoff tournament. And if you have some comments on the hands that I played in the tournament, please leave them below the video or leave a comment on my site. And I hope you liked the video and got something out of it. and I will see you next time. Good luck at the tables, guys.